So the next thing I want to discuss with you is holding deposits. And there's a few little caveats to this, a few rules that you need to follow. I do recommend, even if you're a landlord doing all of this yourself, advertising your own property, renting your own property out, then I do recommend taking a holding deposit. But you can only take 1 week's worth of rent, maximum, the absolute max. So take that. If you've got a load of tenants that come around and view the property and they're making you an offer, it's first come, first served. The first one to put down a holding deposit of 1 week's worth of rent. So what does that do? Well, first of all, it shows commitment from the tenant. That's a definite. And I think if you can get that commitment from the tenant, it shows that they're willing, that they're able to proceed, that they want to proceed. They're not just going around securing a load of properties and putting everyone out of pocket. And there's a story in there. And I've had this conversation with many, many landlords where they've got a property on the market and then a tenant that says, yeah, I want to take it. And then the landlord said, brilliant, taking it off the market. And then 2 weeks later, the tenant says, no, I don't want it now. I was actually just looking around at a load of properties. Because tenants can do that now. Because technically, and I'll tell you about this in a second, they don't have to forfeit that holding deposit. So that means that a tenant can go to your property and say, yes, I'll take it. And then you take yours off the market. Then they go to view some more and they say, oh yeah, I'll take it. And then they go to another one, yeah, I'll take it, yeah, I'll take it. They might even put down lots of holding deposits, who cares? And then they'll choose the one that's best for them out of the 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 that they've put holding deposits down. Or not, some landlords just wouldn't think to take a holding deposit. So if you take a holding deposit, there's a few little things that I want you to know. Good bit of advice on protecting yourself as well. Take a holding deposit, yes, and remember that the tenant does not have the legal obligation to proceed with that tenancy, even if they've paid a holding deposit. Don't take any more than 1 week, but do take the full week. That is for sure. And you cannot charge any other fees to the tenant. So if you're an experienced landlord and you've been doing this for years and you've always done it yourself, the chances are you probably charge the tenant for referencing and administration and processing and management, all of those things. Well, you can't do that anymore. The tenant fee ban came in last year and it sucks. It was terrible for agents, it was terrible for landlords, it was actually terrible for tenants too, but we'll do that another time. Right now, take the holding deposit, maximum of 1 week's rent. Now, you can keep that holding deposit, but only in a few quite strict scenarios. Number one, if your tenant misled you or lied to you and subsequently failed the credit check or the referencing, then you can keep that deposit. Because if you've paid out for referencing, I think this is the right way to do it. If you've paid out for referencing and you've said, yeah, okay, tenant, I'll pay for this referencing because you've told me that you earn 50 grand a year, you work for IBM and you've got 1 child, but it turns out that they earn 15 grand a year and they don't work for IBM and they've got a county court judgment and they've got a default and they've got 10 credit cards and 5 children, then you can keep that deposit. All right, I'm being elaborate there, being dramatic, but you get the point. If the tenant gave you false information and you did the credit check and they failed that credit check because of it, because they gave you false information, you can keep that holding deposit. So if the tenant just decides to withdraw, so you carry out, you take the holding deposit of 1 week's worth of rent, you carry out referencing, you carry out the credit checks, you carry out your checks, everything you need to do, and then you agree them, everyone's happy moving in, and then the tenant withdraws, you can keep the holding deposit. That's their choice. They chose to withdraw from that and forfeit their holding deposit for whatever that reason might be. It doesn't matter. And the last reason is if the tenant fails the right to rent checks, meaning they've come to you, they've given you a holding deposit, and then they've said that, or they've given you the information and then failed the right to rent checks based on that information. You can keep their holding deposit. Now, another little tip here, be a human being. Bear in mind, if you're going to spend some time processing that application or processing that tenant or administering that tenant and they've given you false information, yeah, you're entitled to keep that. But don't be a dick about it. Don't just take their money and see it as a little few £100 that you could just take off the tenant. Because that's just immoral. That's not right. I wouldn't do that. Look, if you are the sort of person that is going to do that, then that's up to you. I'm just advising you that you shouldn't really do that. Right, the next thing is the actual deposit. Now, don't confuse holding deposits with actual deposits. The actual deposit is something different, and there's a lot of rules around deposits you must follow. If you don't follow these, then there will be trouble later down the line, I promise you. So first of all, your deposit can only be up to 5 weeks worth of the rent. Now, I would obviously go for the full 5 weeks worth of rent, of course, because it protects you as a landlord, but it does more than that. It protects you as a landlord against damages and things like that, and the more money you can take for that deposit, the better. But secondly, it also shows willing from the tenant. It shows financial stability from the tenant. If they've got enough money to put down a 5-week deposit, then the chances are they have a little bit of money, or they've saved up money for this property. Now that, for me, shows good security and good stability. So yes, that deposit, 5 weeks maximum. Now here's the parts that you must follow. Please get your pen and paper and write this down. There's a big mistake that a lot of landlords make in this aspect. If you receive a deposit, you must register that deposit with a government approved scheme. Now yeah, you already knew that. That's an obvious bit, but there's a bit more that people miss all the time. A lot of landlords think they've got 30 days to register that deposit. That's technically true, but it's 30 days from the day that you receive the deposit, not 30 days from the tenancy. And that's where so many landlords get it wrong. They think they've just got 30 days from the start of the tenancy. That's not true. And I'll give you a perfect example, and this is where it cost a landlord that I know. So it's a DIY landlord, and he always done everything himself, has done for 20 years. Always managed his own properties, found his own tenants, no problems. Always used to get the deposit, used to hold on to it, he used to accrue a bit of interest, and then register the deposit on the 30th day, right at the last minute. Anyway, in this latest instance, he did that same thing. Tenancy starts on the 1st, I'm just making the date up here. Tenancy started on the 1st, and then on the 1st of the following month, on the last day of that month, he registered that deposit. At the end of the tenancy, he wanted to claim some damages, deductions from the tenant. The tenant disputed it, and also the tenant owed some money in rent. So they went to court, and the judge said, you didn't register the deposit within 30 days. And the landlord said, I'm not going to give his name, but the landlord said, well, yeah, I did, look, I registered it, tenancy started here, I registered it here. And the judge said, no, you are to register the deposit with a government approved scheme within 30 days of receiving the deposit. And that's what he didn't do. So therefore he couldn't make any deductions. And then it gets even worse. And this tenant, look, I don't want to pass too much judgment about the tenant, but the tenant was a proper sponge, because they wanted to get everything they could. Now I admit the tenant is entitled to this compensation. But if you knew the story of that whole tenancy, where the tenant chose not to pay rent, chose to avoid paying rent, avoided the landlord, caused damage to the property, it was pretty awful. Was quite aggressive towards the landlord as well, but that's a whole other thing. Anyway, so when it came to it, this landlord then had to pay the tenant 3 times the deposit amount. 3 times. And had to pay the deposit back. And had to pay for all the damages that the tenant did, because he couldn't deduct them from the tenant's deposit. The judge even said, I know that the tenant has caused this damage, but I cannot legally charge him for that. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. But these are the problems that you face, Mr. and Mrs. Landlord, if you don't follow this stuff. So that's why I'm doing this, because stories like that just piss me off. When you've got an innocent landlord who's tried to do everything right, who's tried to do everything that's right for the tenant, has always done. Really good bloke. This landlord's a really good guy. Never had an issue with any property, any tenant ever in 20 years. But in this one instance, he got one tenant who's looked up on the internet about deposits and then found out, oh, hello, I can get some money here. And I tell you what, look, this is the same in any walk of life, in any industry, with any person, anywhere. When you mess about with money, when you're offering someone money, people's mindset changes. They turn into something different. And that's a whole different podcast. We'll get right into that another time. But the point I'm trying to make here is make sure you register that deposit within 30 days of receiving it. Remember that? And it's got to be registered with either the DPS, which is the Deposit Protection Scheme, or the TDS, which is the Tenancy Deposit Scheme, or My Deposits, which is My Deposits. Those three are the government approved schemes that you must register a deposit with every single deposit that you register. There's another problem if you don't register that deposit. You cannot give the standard notices to the tenant to leave the property. Those notices are section 21, which is for any reason. You can ask a tenant to leave with 2 months notice for any reason. That's a section 21 notice. It's all part of the Housing Act. Or there's a section 8 notice, which is a 2-week notice period, and that's for when your tenant is more than 2 months in arrears, or antisocial behaviour, or serious damage, those sorts of things, more serious reasons that you need to evict a tenant. You can't use those standard notices. You have to apply directly to the courts for an eviction, which can take longer, and it can cost more money, and the judge might prevent or delay or withhold something. You're kind of putting it in someone else's hands. So just do that. Anyway, that's banging on about registering deposits.